The sounds of awakening were heard across the New England colonies in the early 1730s, with revivals that touched the center of one's emotions. The terrors of hell and the beauty of God's grace led to a rejuvenated and lively faith, but often carried with it unstable and ecstatic behavior. To some, the Great Awakening symbolized the joy of personal relationship with a sovereign God, but to others, it represented the defeat of tradition, orderly conduct, and hierarchical structure. St. Philip's Church stood as the antithesis of awakening sentiment since its founding in 1681. As the oldest religious congregation in South Carolina, St. Philip's embodied the Anglican authority officially established in the colony in the beginning of the 18th century. Situated in the small town of Charleston, the building boldly interrupted the area's city grid and asserted its intimidating authority over the town's inhabitants. Although damaged by a hurricane and refinished in 1723, St. Philip's grand architecture had social, spiritual, and political significance that did not escape its observers.
It's often represented as either the eagle representing the Gospel according to St. John, the eagle being the bird that flies the highest. And then other churches like Bruton Parish and Williamsburg, for instance, have an angel. So you could either think of it as the angel bringing God's word to people, or you could think of the Holy Spirit raising us to where we can receive the word. And so symbolism that in the front of the HIUS Dei, behold the Lamb of God, with the victorious Lamb representing the risen Christ, and the church banner. The angels representing, as I said earlier, the vision of Isaiah 61, in the year that King Uzziah died. And then also suggested too of the revelation of St. John the Divine.
The most significant component of interior design was perhaps the pulpit, a high structure that signified power, reverence for the Word of God, and genteel authority. Behind it stood a man who too embodied the principles of Anglicanism, a man synonymous with St. Philip's itself, Alexander Garden, and unlike the vulnerable building, was able to fight back against outside attacks. Alexander Garden was a Scottish clergyman for the Church of England. Educated at the University of Aberdeen, he then moved to South Carolina in 1719. Garden's passion for the Anglican establishment was apparent upon his arrival. He devoted a great deal of time to keeping French Huguenots, Scots Presbyterians, Baptists, and other non-Anglican churches in check. He saw their very existence, which was significant in the Low Country, as a threat to authority.
In 1720, Garden became rector of St. Philip's, and in 1729 was also established as the Bishop of London's commissary.
America had no bishop, no Anglican bishops, they never did, but they did need some sort of hierarchical authorities to call the shots in certain regions. And so Alexander Garden, the rector of St. Philip's here, was the commissary for the Bishop of London. So that gave him kind of a synodical kind of power over other ministers in the area. He would be kind of the lead pastor, if you will.
In his new position, Garden became increasingly alarmed of dissenting notions. As word of awakening spread, he was determined not to let them materialize in his colony, and certainly not in his church. But, in fact, they did. By 1740, the Great Awakening had infiltrated the town of Charleston, and its most prolific spokesman, George Whitefield, sat in one of St. Philip's pews. Although Whitefield was warmly welcomed by Garden during his first arrival in 1738, his subsequent visits revealed an impassioned man bent on shaking the foundations of traditional Anglicanism.
The Bishop of London's commissary, the Reverend Mr. Garden, a good soldier of Jesus Christ, received me in a most Christian manner. He and several others offered me a lodging and were more than civil to me. How does God raise me up friends wherever I go?
Despite the warm meeting, the welcoming would not last. Without mincing words, Garden confronted the attending Whitefield head-on. The occasion was a perfect microcosm for the larger events taking place.
Went to church and heard the commissary represent me under the character of the Pharisee who came to the temple saying, God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are.
Whitefield kind of got under Garden's skin because he started talking about he didn't like the balls and the theaters and all the secular kind of entertainments that were going on, and Garden didn't think there was anything wrong with that. That kind of got him off on a bad foot. But eventually, when Whitefield preached against these things and actually preached against some of the local Anglican ministers, including Garden, kind of suggesting that they may not be regenerate, that's when Garden really started attacking Whitefield.
One of the core issues of the Whitefield-Garden controversy was a theological argument. Whitefield accused Garden of preaching works righteousness salvation.
He charged me with enthusiasm and pride for speaking against the generality of clergy. He then asked me wherein the clergy was so much to blame. I answered, they did not preach justification by faith alone, and upon talking with the commissary, I found he was as ignorant as the rest.
Good works do as necessarily spring from and accompany a true and lively faith, whether before or after justification. If this be an error, if in this I'm departed from the gospel and the articles of the church, you will not endeavor to restore me. I assure you, 'tis as much the cool of the day with me now as it has been in any part of my life.
The Whitefield-Garden controversy attracted the attention of other colonial ministers. Andrew Croswell, an avid Newlite, commented on the controversy, taking the side of Whitefield.
As Ishmael's mocking Isaac, Genesis 21:9 is by the inspired apostle thus described. I may for the same reason assert the same thing, both of the present age and of the present case. Mockings, scoffs, and jeers of the pious and Reverend Mr. Whitefield for his strict adherence to the Holy Scriptures, as well as the articles and homilies of the Church of England. Then Mr. Garden has persecuted Mr. Whitefield, as Ishmael persecuted Isaac.
Whitefield believed in immediate, instantaneous conversion apart from works. That was not exactly how the typical Anglican in America described salvation. They were much more formal. They really kind of shied away from any kind of emotionalism. And immediate conversion kind of speaks to an emotional experience, right? So Garden, for example, would say that Whitefield's view of regeneration and justification were wrong. That we need to teach the people from early age to believe the gospel, to confirm them, to go through the catechisms, etc., and that they would eventually work their way into a relationship with God. And works were not apart from that. That was part of the process.
To Garden, Whitefield was an astronomical threat. Not only did he bring with him the emotional and unstructured nature of the Great Awakening, but he did so as an Anglican minister. Whitefield's increasing support among Garden's parishioners gave the impression that the Church of England was beginning to self-destruct.
My lord, among the many ill effects of Whitefield's licentious example, one is the starting of several impostors in these parts, pretending themselves in Church of England orders, and strolling about with province to province, preaching in the fields.
Yet despite Garden's attacks, Whitefield continued to draw large crowds in and around Charleston, and his speeches often moved his hearers to tears. He briefly reflected, many moral good sort of men who before were settled on the knees were awakened to seek after Jesus Christ.
Garden would not let him preach in the church. That's one of the reasons, and in other places, that Whitefield preached most of his awakening sermons outside. It was because a lot of the churches didn't want to have him in the building because he was accusing their ministers of not being true Christians. But also, just for a practical reason, that these churches were not large enough to hold the crowds that were coming to hear him preach.
Went to church in the morning and afternoon and heard the commissary preach as virulent, unorthodox, and inconsistent a discourse as ever I heard in my life. His heart seemed full of choler and resentment. I immediately retired to my lodgings, rejoicing that I was accounted worthy to suffer this further degree of contempt for my dear Lord's sake. The commissary seemed to ransack church history for instances of enthusiasm and abused grace. I did not feel the least resentment against the preacher. I prayed for him, and wished from my soul that the Lord would convert him as he once did the persecutor Saul, and let him know that it is Jesus whom he persecutes.
Until his resignation in 1753, Alexander Garden was unable to prevent the Great Awakening from infiltrating Charleston, South Carolina.
The audiences were more numerous than ever, and it was supposed not less than 4,000 were in and about the meeting house when I preached my farewell sermon.
I argue that Whitefield kind of won out. I think Garden's view kind of lost sway, especially with some of the laymen in the congregation here at St. Philip's. People like Henry Lawrence and others started monetarily supporting Whitefield, supporting his orphanage, and you kind of see a gravitation toward Whitefield in some ways.
A large part of George Whitefield's ministry was to reinvigorate the SPG's mission to Christianize slaves. He once wrote, "Enslaving or misusing their bodies would, comparatively speaking, be an inconsiderable evil, was proper care taken of their souls."
I do know that slave servants often came to church with their families. Some of them would sit up in the balconies. And of course, the music was one of the most wonderful things that they gave to us. But also know, too, that contrary to what's published and contrary to the quote-unquote laws, many were taught to read, and many were taught the Bible.
In 1740, it appeared that Garden himself even took steps to heed this advice. He proposed a comprehensive education plan and established the Charleston Negro School in 1742. Garden envisioned a system in which young slaves would be trained as teachers, who would then instruct their peers. In this way, he compared slave educational training to skilled labor apprenticeships.
He started out training 2 young men, and then eventually trained others. And so that was a real important endeavor, I think.
However, even in this, Garden continued to cling to the orderly and hierarchical principles of the Anglican Church. In teaching slaves, Garden concentrated more on civilizing than evangelizing. As Whitefield and others saw, this would often lead to pride and impudence rather than conversion. Perhaps even more noteworthy, though, is the fact that the Negro School effectively took slaves out of the church. Throughout the following centuries, slaves continued to disappear from the Anglican communion services. Whether this action was deliberate on the part of Garden seems probable, but uncertain.
I don't know. I haven't really looked at it close enough to know. It seems plausible. I've seen that. I remember Nelson talking about that. It's something I'm just not sure about, though.
Alexander Garden represented the Anglican Church's dying efforts to restore Southern society to its 17th century structure. But the times had already changed. The Great Awakening's impact at St. Philip's highlights the larger American narrative of disestablishment versus establishment, change versus tradition, and individualism versus hierarchy.
Today, St. Philip's Church continues to stand in Charleston, but it is a church battered by time and rebuilt by modern hands. Each clash with hurricane or fire resulted in a change to the old structure. So too was the church's clash with the spiritual fire of the Great Awakening. Despite the efforts of Alexander Garden, revivalism had already enacted a visible change on the people of Charleston.
The American mainland had been awakened, and there was little anyone could do to put the stirred giant back to sleep.